It's almost like a military operation here. It feels so real. All right, everyone else who's still coming in, it's too late, so let's just start and dive into it because we've got a lot of stuff to cover. So what we're going to talk about today, I have called this Leave the Cartoons Out of Azure, which is a little bit cryptical, but yeah, it will become clear on what I'm talking about in a few slides. What we're talking about is creating a naming and tagging strategy for Azure, probably something everyone who deals with Azure deals with at some point in time. So first let me introduce myself quickly, because I tend to forget that within real life sessions for some reason. My name is Barbara Forbes, and I am an Azure MVP as well as a GitHub star. I work as the Azure Technical Lead for OGD in the Netherlands. I have a blog on Azure and automation, which you can find at Forbes with a 4.nl. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can find me at BA4BES, and that's also my GitHub handle. So, before we dive in, I need to thank our sponsors who's made this event possible. These kind of community events can't happen without sponsors, so both these sponsors and these sponsors, a lot of thanks to them for helping us out. Probably seen them already somewhere. And one special mention, I can be here because my company offered to help with the expenses for this trip. So OGD is my personal sponsor. So I am here because of them. So out of that, we're now going to talk first a little bit about the history of naming conventions. How did we used to do it? How should we do it now? So a little bit of why did we get to this situation? After that, I'm going to talk about recommendations, and these are based on Microsoft best practices. They're also based on my personal experience. I've worked as an Azure consultant for a few years. I've done some assessments, so I've seen a lot of environments, and I've seen the same issues at all environments. So yeah, maybe some tips and tricks that can help you out. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about how you can enforce stuff and how you can automate stuff, because no one wants to do manual stuff, and we want people to have their space, but also to follow the rules. So the first thing we need to consider is how do we decide on what to name our stuff? And people who were system administrators long time ago, they might remember when servers were these entities that we used to love because we had little of them. So they were our pets. We fed them updates. We'd pet them if they did well, and we loved them, and we had to say goodbye to them. And yeah, I've seen a funeral being held for a server. So they were our pets, they were our friends, and we gave them names that fit that, which were very funny but not very practical. And these are all names I've seen in practice. I've seen the Disney characters, I've seen Asterix, and if you know the strips, the comics, with Asterix, the problem is that all the names are very similar, so if you have never read those comics, this is very confusing. I've seen vegetables, which was awesome. The backup server was called Carrot, that kind of stuff. By the way, the server that was called Apple was not actually the Apple server, just for fun. Animals with a maximum of 3 letters, I've seen this, and thankfully that's a lot easier it is in Dutch than it is in English, but it's still quite a challenge. And the famous scientist, yeah, we can have a discussion if it's a good idea to call your server Darwin, but I've seen it happen. By the way, the illustration is my own little pet. That's my dog, and he is called Cody. And yeah, it's dog tags, always good to show dogs. So we had our servers, they were our friends, they were our pets, and we loved them dearly, but times changed, and we got hypervisors, and we got more servers, and more than that, we got infrastructure as code, and servers became disposable and replaceable. And this is a saying I didn't think of, that's something that's been around. Our servers are no longer their pets, they are cattle. We have a lot of them, and if they break, we create new ones. So we get naming conventions like DC1, DC2, which explains what you're looking at, what it is. You don't need to have a separate sheet which explains to you what the server is actually doing, because you can see it right there. By the way, this is not my cow. I'm not allowed to keep cows in the city. So domain controller, stuff like that. So it's a good thing that you know what the server is doing. The bad thing can be that other people who you don't want to know what your server is doing know it as well. So then I also saw naming conventions like the one you see, the second one, the Windows 1.2.3, Windows 1.2.4, stuff like that. And there is our Excel sheet again to find out what server does what. This was a company, by the way, with more than 100 servers. So yeah, It was very complicated for anyone new coming into the organization. They need to check that Excel sheet and find out what the file server was. So, okay, this worked, even for larger environment. You used the numbers to keep track. And then Azure came along. And we no longer have pets, we no longer have cattle, we have a complete zoo at our hands. We have all different kind of resources, all stuff that's doing different things, and we have so much more than we used to have. The thing is that even the smallest environments that I've seen, you easily get to 100 resources without even trying. Because if you deploy one web app, then you also need an app service. And if you deploy one virtual machine, then you also need a NIC and a disk. So you need a lot of stuff, and they're all different resources. They can be in different countries and stuff like that. There's a lot more to keep track of. And what we used to do just doesn't work anymore. Because we get it like this. If we treat them like cattle, yeah, these are 5 servers. This is just the 5 disks. Below it are 5 NICs. And they are all part of the 5 virtual machines that are beyond them. If you can imagine a list like this is getting crazy very quickly, and you won't keep track of whatever is happening. So we need something better than this. Good thing is we have something that can help us in Azure, which is tags, which we're also going to talk about. The tags is a way to store metadata about that resource in the resource itself. So you can see it right there in the portal. So you don't need an Excel sheet somewhere explaining what the resource is, although in practice I still see them happening a lot. But you can see it right there in the portal. I'm going to talk a little bit later about what tags can be very helpful to keep track of your environment. So I want to consider this, what would be the perfect naming convention in Azure. The perfect naming convention is that it doesn't matter what name a resource has, but everything is covered in infrastructure as code. And you have your templates, and you see on your templates what's happening. No one ever visits the portal, and you have a constructive tagging policy in there, so you can see for every resource what it exactly is. Now I'm wondering, is there anyone here who is working in one way or another with Azure in a company where the portal is never used for Azure management? Exactly. We don't live in a perfect world. We live in an IT world, which is fine, but we need the portal, and we need to have constructive names. This doesn't work. Maybe in 20 years, probably not, I think. So, yeah, that's not the perfect way. So let's consider what I would recommend. First of all, there is no perfect way, because every naming convention depends on what your company actually needs. So that's one of the first important things to remember. I can give you examples of what I would do, but that doesn't mean that that would work for you. So you need to consider what would work for you. First thing we need to think about is, why should we care? Why do we care about that naming convention? Why is it important? Well, the things we just saw, it's very easy to lose track in Azure. There's a lot of resources there, a lot of different things to manage, and it's very easy to lose the idea of what is a resource for and how important is it. But the biggest thing is that when the resources are not named correctly, it's easy to make mistakes. It's easy to pick the wrong resource to do stuff with. And as much as we sometimes like to deny it, we're all human, and we make mistakes. And mistakes happen, and you can only help yourself thinking with, how can I prevent myself from making mistakes, or make the chance smaller, and that's by, for example, knowing exactly which resource is doing what. So how do we start? First thing we need to think about is, when we define that naming convention, we need to create it as a team. So in most cases, there's a team that is working in Azure. Sometimes there's multiple teams, but often there's one team that has the role of what is called the Azure Platform Team. So the role of managing the Azure environment. And most of the times it doesn't work if one person comes up and says, this is your naming convention. Because people are going to feel irritated that they're part of what they think is important in the naming convention isn't part of it. And if they're really, it can happen that they just think, well, I'm going to do it my way. And you get a lot of noise, and yeah, you missed your goal. So you need to do this together, decide what does our company actually need. Both for naming, by the way, and for tagging as well. You need to consider, what do we actually need and what are we going to set up. Then the thing we generally don't really like, and that's documentation. Document your naming strategy, make sure it's available to everyone who touches Azure. Document your tagging strategy, and most important, document why tags are important and why a part of a name is important. I have found that if I just say to someone, you need to enter that tag, they will think, well, that's not that serious, I can just leave it out. But if I explain to them, this is why this tag is needed, then they understand and they make more of an effort to actually use that tag. And after that, you check up on people, see if they're doing it right, and you enforce where you can. Can't do that everywhere, but there are some ways, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So the recommended naming convention is of a few elements that are part of that name. And I didn't come up with this myself, this is from the Microsoft documentation. With the Cloud Adoption Framework, there are some recommendations on how you can do your naming convention. One that can be handy is to define the resource type. Now, that doesn't matter if you're working with the portal, because you can see right next to the resource what the resource type is. And there's a little picture. But if you're automating stuff, this can be very handy. If you're getting stuff from the Azure CLI or from PowerShell, it's handy to see what resource you're dealing with. And then they say the business unit. And this is a kind of a difficult one when you're working with smaller companies where business units might not be a thing. Are you going to use team names? Really depends on your company, but it's very risky to use team names because teams are renamed all the time and teams stop existing and new teams take over the applications. So while this may work in some environments, it is good to think about the future and if you want it in a later time. And I have just seen that again with an environment that I managed a long time ago and I recently saw again where all kind of resources are named after teams that no longer exist. And the most confusing part, who is responsible for it now? No idea. Because that's the downside of Azure naming is that you cannot change them. You cannot change the name of a resource. Only way to do that is to create new resources. So already a tricky one. You need to think about what works for your company. And a business unit can be pretty safe. Marketing, IT, finance, something like that, mostly always stays around and it stays within the same business unit. And then I'd like to use an application or a service name, and I'd like this to be pretty descriptive. I see people using abbreviations for this. There are some exceptions, but we'll come in later, but overall I'd like this to be descriptive, so everyone can see immediately what's going on here. So for some reason the Microsoft documentation uses SharePoint as an example for everything, so I copied that, but there are other ways to run SharePoint in the cloud. Anyway, but something like SharePoint, monitoring the sheets for the hours where people can keep their hours. So it's very descriptive of what this resource is doing. Then the subscription type, again, is one that you can use or cannot use, whether it fits your organization. If you have landing zones, that might help. If you have shared subscriptions and client subscriptions, that might help. If you don't have any of these, leave them out. If it's not of use for you, don't use it. Better to keep it short and simple. The deployment environment is one I do really like to put in there, the production, development stage, or test. And here again you have the dilemma. Do you use an abbreviation of, this is 3 to 5 letters, or do you just use one letter? Because one letter is enough. You have enough separate letters. But then again, how big is the chance of someone making a mistake and doing something to a production resource that's actually a development resource, but that's just one letter mistake. And actually it's the same letter turned around. So, can be a risk. But then again, this is extra letters. So, something to decide for yourself. What do you feel comfortable with your team? And the region can be very handy to define what region is the resource located in. And if you're very local, that won't be that much a problem. But what if you're expanding stuff and you want to create the same resource but in different regions? Then you'd be very happy that you used region in there. The abbreviation that Microsoft uses is longer than this. They say West Europe, North Europe, and West US, North US. But in our case, with here in Europe and in the UK, I think 2 letters can be enough. But again, it's your point to decide. Are we comfortable with this? So in practice, that would come to this. And this is the example that's on the Microsoft documentation. And I wanted to show it because this is not what I would choose. This is what they say by default. They start with a resource type, a public IP address in this case, then a workload application, then the environment, then the Azure region, and the one that they didn't mention, the instance. An instance or an index number, I've seen a lot of people don't really like to use them, but I think they're very handy because I've seen it so often that you want to create a number 2 or you wanted to create an extra run or you want to do an update, or you want to have another instance. So I'm always with it doesn't hurt to have one. And if it's just 0, 1, then you know you did it right in the first time. Now the reason why I wouldn't use this one is because the first thing is resource type. And in the portal, stuff seems to be sorted alphabetically. And this means that your stuff will be sorted according to resource type. And you can already very easily do that in Azure, because you can call every resource type on their own. So I would like to start with a workload or a business unit, so that I know that all the resources that are part of that workload and business unit are on the same, are bundled together in the portal by default. There are some ways to work around it, but that's just how I prefer to do it in the naming convention. So by default, it's already grouped in the way that I want it to be grouped. So I would go with this. Exact same resource. I added a business unit at the front, then a service and application. Then the environment, I chose 1 letter because this name is already pretty long, this naming convention. And then the region, the resource type and the index number. So this is a resource group. Again, this is just how I would do it. And if a company comes up to me now and says, hey, we're starting Azure, we need a naming convention, maybe something else will come up. Because I always talk to the company and say, hey, these are the options that you have. What do you feel comfortable with? So we now have done all our work. We've done everything we needed to do to set up a great naming convention. So we've got everything under control. And then the challenges come up. Of course, it's not that easy, because if it was that easy, I wouldn't have a session of 50 minutes of this. There are some challenges within Azure, some issues that can come up. The first challenge, resource names do not have to be unique within a resource, some resource names. So these are, for example, virtual machines with everything surrounding them. And these are 2 of them, one in North Europe, one in West Europe. And I've actually seen this in practice. These were 2 production environments with exactly the same names. Very big chance of just a little oopsie having very big consequences. So it's something to be aware of, that this is possible. These are in different resource groups, but they are in the same subscription. No problem at all. What could possibly go wrong? So something to be aware of. Then we have the other resources, the resources that do need to be unique. And they don't even need to be unique on your own environment, they need to be unique globally. That's mostly because they are part of a URL. And I didn't do anything to get this screenshot. I didn't create anything myself. I just kept pressing the T until the message disappeared. And that was with 1 more. So there are a lot of people using the same strategy out there. So as I said, this is mostly with stuff with URLs. So it makes sense that they need to be unique. So that's storage accounts, that is web apps, that is key vaults, stuff like that. And I must say, in practice, when a good naming convention is used, I have never seen this be an issue that someone else already has your naming convention. I have never seen that happen. What I have seen happen is that we had a test tenant, and we had a pipeline, and we deployed everything to the test tenant to see if our infrastructure as code was correct. And then we approved it, and then it would go to production. And in production, it would say, this resource name already exists, because it was in our test tenant. So then we had to change our environment a little bit. But I've never seen this actually be an issue. This one can be an issue, a security issue. If you have any resource that needs globally unique, everyone can do a ping or an NS lookup to that DNS name. So what they can get with that is the IP address where they can find that resource. And maybe it's not even that big a deal if something's publicly available, but even if you have a private link, so you make sure that your application is in your private environment, this still works and people can get your private IP. That means that if they get into your network, and they have done this before and seen super secret financial app 01, there's multiple. If they've seen that one, they know, hey, this is where I need to aim for. So you've given them the internal IP address that they should search for. So that's something to be very aware of. This can be a security issue. This is not only Azure, by the way. This is with every internet-facing thing. You need to think about the DNS names that you use, because everyone can get this. To fix this, by the way, what we did was say in a naming convention, never have the company name in a public resource. By the way, company names overall seem not to be a good idea. Overall, companies get renamed or merged all the time, so overall, and it doesn't add that much. And what we decided was for public resources, never use something like this is financial app, or this is super secret, or this is customer, or this is anything else can be important. We used abbreviations that the company understands, but people from the outside don't. And then our favorite one, specific resource rules. Not all resources can have the same names. There's a lot of resources that can be like 260 characters long. When you move to the web resources, you often get 60 characters long. But for example, an app service is 40 characters maximum. And this one, I think everyone has seen, the storage accounts. Storage accounts, they can only be lowercase letters and numbers. Names must be between 3 and 24 characters. And there goes your naming convention. You got a beautiful naming convention, and I guarantee you, once it's in a storage account, it's completely unreadable. Okay, so this is our life now, and we need to keep track of this when we're deploying stuff automatically. We can't just say this name can be used, because it probably can't be. And this is just a storage account, but then we have stuff like this. A vault. This is a key vault. A key vault name is between 3 and 24 alphanumeric characters, and it must begin with a letter and end with a letter or digit. This you only find out if you run a blog that starts with a number, and you want every unique Azure resource to be part of you. I got all the other ones, but a key vault doesn't want one. So now we need to keep track of that. Okay, well, we can fix this. We can handle this. Because that's one of the other things I think is a very good idea to have as little unique conventions as possible. I've seen companies create unique conventions for every resource type there is. Which isn't that weird, because that's what the Microsoft documentation is doing. They have a whole list for all resources and how you can create a naming convention. I suggest to make this as little unique conventions as possible. One, because there are a lot of Azure resources out there, so otherwise you had a very long list, and you're never going to get them all. New resources coming out, types are coming out all the time, and you're going to miss that. So we have 4 unique conventions. We have a regular resource name, which I would recommend a maximum of 60 characters, although you can go to 250, 260. Then a short resource name for stuff like key vaults. The storage account name, because it's special, so it can have no name. And the virtual machine name, because virtual machines can have a maximum of 15 characters. This is mostly Windows virtual machines. That's not the fault of Azure, that's the fault of Windows, where a computer name is a maximum of 15 characters within the OS itself. So, okay, we need a complete different one for that. And we didn't want the company name, so let's tend to not do that altogether. Let's tend to not have descriptive names in public resources. You can also choose, is it only in public or in every one of them? And no numbers at the start. So I think we have about all the resources now. And if anyone here thinks, well, I have a resource after the session, come see me and we'll cry about it together. So now we got everything under control. We got a very clean naming convention that works for every resource. And then Azure comes along. There are resources where you cannot control the naming convention. And this one is a little tricky because you can control it a little bit, but you don't want to, because this is a runbook in an automation account. Runbooks are their own resources. And you're not going to do a naming convention for runbooks because it's going to drive you crazy. So now I have a nice naming convention and then the runbook that I called Get Help. And yeah, it appears like that in Azure. And this is one of the examples, but you also, for example, have the Network Watcher resource group, which is a name that Azure gives it. You have the Recovery Services vault, which makes a resource group to store the backups. And yeah, you have some influence on it, but mostly it makes it yourself. So you made a beautiful naming convention, and Azure says, yeah, not all resources are yours to make. It is getting better, by the way. There are changes being made to that. So it's not like you need to accept your faith, but yeah, at this point you kind of do. So you can never get it perfectly, and that's why we have tags. So we have a pretty solid naming convention. We know what everything is, but it's still limited. We have a limited amount of characters. Like I said, a storage account is barely readable when you create it, even with a naming convention, but tags can really help you out. Tags is where you store the metadata of your application or of your resource. And tags are very flexible. You can do anything you want with it, and they are changeable. They are not set in stone. You can still change them. So it can be very handy. I've set up some examples of tags that I really like to use. A bunch of these are from the documentation, again, but a bunch of these I made up myself, or I have found in practice that are very handy. On the environment and the cost center, stuff like that, I don't really need to explain thinking. With a cost, I think with a cost center, you can say who is responsible for the cost, and you can set up some automation in the billing there. In environment, you can see very quickly if something is production or development and how much care you should take. The deployment date is one I come to love, and I don't think this gets enough love in Azure environments. When you describe when a resource is deployed and you come back a few years later, which I often do, then you will know, okay, we have a resource, we don't know what it is for and who created it, and I guarantee that's going to happen. By seeing the deployment date, you can see, hey, this is a little bit older, so it's probably not that important anymore, or maybe whoever created this isn't there anymore, and where should I search? Where if something was deployed like a month ago, you can still ask whatever team you think created it, like what's going on. So it gives you some leeway when you have resources where you're not sure what where they came from. So that can help. It can be very helpful. An end date as well. If you have specific projects that are meant to be temporary, well, we all know there's nothing that takes as long as a temporary solution. So with an end date, we know for sure, we can see, hey, this has reached an end date. We can even automate that to send us an email. Hey, this project has reached an end date. Let's go check if it's still needed. The owner is handy for that as well, so you can check who you actually need to ask about that resource, especially in larger environments where people are using Azure, especially in landing zones, stuff like that. You can make this a team or a person. I've sometimes even used creator next to this to define I was the one who created it and it was for my team. So something like that can help you keep track of a larger environment. One I personally really like, and I know it's not the way you're supposed to use tags, but I like to create a description. A description is like 2 sentences that tell someone what that resource does. And I have used it for customers where I set up the base of their Azure environment, and then I'm like, so this is your Azure now. That happens. And I want to make sure that they know what they're doing, but it can be difficult, and they have a lot of information to progress. So I create a description that says this little resource does this, or even a link to where they can find the documentation. I really love that one because it's right there with the resource, so I don't have to go into the docs. The repository and the build number is if you use Git and CI/CD, or CI/CD, one of the two, especially with infrastructure as code. And this is also from practice. We have had a situation where we had a resource, and we knew it came from infrastructure as code, and we couldn't find the code. We had no idea where it was, and this was right at the start of Azure DevOps, and we were moving from our previous Git provider to that. And we had a few repositories, you know how life works, let's start again, let's start again. And we completely lost the code. And I think we did find it, but from that day we started with a little URL or even description of where the code can be found. Same thing is the tracking number. If you have some sort of tracking system, if you have something like System Now where you have tickets, you can very easily find information about that resource. And the final one, which is the most important one, is automation. You can filter based on resources, and this is just an example where you say for a virtual machine, if backup enabled is true, then automatically have it be part of the recovery services vault. I also use this for start-stop scripts for virtual machines. So I said if the tag is this, start and stop it. I even had one in my lab that a tag that's auto-delete, and then I have a function running through my environment every evening. Well, it's broken now, but every evening runs through the environment, and if the tag is auto-delete, it deletes those resources, which is handy in a lab environment because stuff can get very expensive and very messy. So for automation, tags are awesome, really great use. So these are just a few that I would personally use in an environment. So we have set up our standards and we set up our ideas and how we want everything done, or how we're going to make sure that everyone keeps to that. There are a few ways you can enforce that, and there are a few ways where you can make it easier for people to do that. And the first thing we can think about is the Azure Policy, which is especially very handy if you're thinking of tags. And I'm going to show that, if I can. Yeah, there we go. So with Azure Policies, you can set rules for your environment. You set descriptions of this is the rule I want to set, and then you assign it to a certain scope. So like a subscription or a resource group, you say these are the rules you have to follow. You can do this in auditing mode, so you can just have an overview of this is what's going wrong, or you can set it in deny mode, where you actually say if you don't use these rules, then you are not able to deploy a resource or use a resource. And there are a lot of them specifically for tagging. So if we look at the definitions, which are below here, we have a bunch of built-in definitions that were created by Microsoft. So here I actually have a category for this. I can search over here, the category tags. And these are all resources that have something to do with tags. And I'll zoom this out a little bit. So I can actually add a require tag plus a certain value, which I have never used in practice, but it could be something. You can say you want a tag to be added once it's created, or add a certain tag to resources, to resource group. You can say it has to inherit stuff. So if a resource group has a tag, all the resource in it also should have it. So there are a lot of options there. So it's a bit of a search what works best for you. And one that I always like to do is require a tag. And I don't want to set the value because I want the people who use it to set the value, but it does require that tag. So if I click on this, all these things are created in JSON, and you also can create ones yourself with JSON. So you can create your own definition if one of these doesn't fit. So we'll not go into that definition too much because of the time, but here what I can do is assign this policy. So I can assign this to a scope. So I set it to all my subscriptions. I choose a specific subscription. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a specific resource group because this is my lab, and I guarantee you I'm going to forget about this one. And later I'm going to wonder why I cannot deploy a resource because I set my own policies. So this is a good name for a resource group that needs tagging. So I can require some tagging in this specific resource group. And here I can set the parameters. And for the parameters, I can define the tag name that I want to use. So you might need multiple policies for multiple tags. And here I can use the example environment. So I want someone to define if this production or development or whatever names I'm using and how many I have. So I can skip remediation, and then I can set a non-compliance message, which I do recommend you use, because especially if the tag is first being enforced, sometimes it will just say, yeah, you are not compliant to policy. Good luck. So it can help your users to have some message here like, don't forget the environment tag. So very helpful, very professional. So I set the non-compliance message, and I can create this, and now this is going to be active on that resource group. Now, as you see at the top, that will take around 30 minutes to take into effect. So I did a little bit cheating, and I already assigned it to a resource group, the same one, because we're not going to wait for that. So there are no resources in here yet. I'm going to click Create, and I'll create my favorite resource, the storage account. And what will happen if I choose that resource group we just saw? So requires tagging. And for some reason in my environment, it always chooses the wrong location wherever I am. So here it is West Europe, which is allowed by policy. So I just created resource group, that storage account name. I will do a very intelligent naming convention resource name. Too long. I got the situation where I just pushed some letters and it said this already exists. I got that for the first time 2 days ago. I said I just wanted to pound the keyboard and it already existed. So when I click Review Create, it says validation failed. Required information is missing or not valid. So it even helps if I'm not aware of what policies are whatsoever. It tells me what is wrong. So there's a red dot here, which means error. You need to do stuff. So I move here. And it says here, you need a tag named environment. So it even helps me out when I create a resource. to set the right tag there. So if I set environment and I say production, oh yeah, it never remembers that. Yeah. And then production. And now I do review and create again. Did I miss it? Yeah. Like that. Come on, you should be happy now. Ah, it gave me the point of the other thing you need to remember with tags. Capitalization matters. They're case sensitive. So you need to be careful with that. And this should work. Does anyone see a typo I've made? No, this looks good, right? Maybe there's a space, yeah. Come on, do it. Let's just do.
You have a space when you're making it, so you just need to add space.
Make sure it's set to environment, not environment type.
Yeah.
And production, yeah, something went wrong with this. It's the autocomplete stuff of Edge. So if I remove that, now we got the environment. There we go. It does show how it looks at tags, which can be very helpful. So this was the one. If there's a space there, it's a different tag. Awesome. Really great that it works that way. If there's a capital there, it sees it as a different tag. So it really actually helps that the tagging is like, yeah, that's not the same. They had a point. So if I was just a user doing this, then I would, I would probably call someone and say, help. But I would get the right results. So now I am able to deploy this. So the policies for tagging actually work very well that way. That didn't used to be like that, by the way. In a few years back, this would give some real issues with, especially the resources created by Azure. But that seemed to have been solved a lot. It is good to stay critical, to see, is this not causing problems with one resource or another? Because it can happen. Oh, we've got a lot of time left. Then Azure Policy naming convention. Can you do naming convention as well? The answer is yes, you can, but you should wonder if you want to, because it can give a lot of errors and you need to add a lot of exceptions. This one I didn't create myself. If you look for Azure Policy naming convention, you see a lot of things that people have created and initiatives that people have taken. I think it's gonna give issues in one point or another. You see it with this one. You think, oh, I'll just deploy this and all my resource groups will have the right name. Except your network watcher will give an issue. And the resources that were deployed by the resource group that were deployed by the recovery services fault. And what else might there be there that will break when you use this? So you can set those exceptions. You can make this all work. You can make it happen, but I think it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of setting it to auditing mode to feel if it actually works. So I'm not too crazy about using Azure policies for naming convention. I've never done it in the wild. I've never done it for any company because it was always too much effort compared to just educating people on what they were doing and yelling at them when they did it wrong. But I did find another solution, which I want to go all the way into, but yeah, that would be a separate session. With infrastructure as code, what I really like to do is use infrastructure as code to make it as easy as possible for people to use a tagging a convention and a naming convention. And Bicep has given us an option to do that pretty easily. You can also do this with ARM templates, but it needs a little bit more of copy-pasting. And that's all the logic behind a naming convention. You put that into your infrastructure as code. So you create variables there that use this kind of information and create the right naming convention for all your resources. And what you can do with Bicep is make that a module. And a module is a little piece of Bicep code that you can use and then use in another Bicep file. So you can refer to it and you don't have to copy-paste it or write it twice. And I made something like this where the parameters are all the parts of that naming convention. And I even use abbreviations here, but you don't need to do that. You can have that logic in your bicep file. The environment is production, and it will take only the first letter to create the naming convention, for example. The business unit name, I could have spelled it out completely and just used the first 3 letters. The index is padded in bicep. You can do that in bicep. In the ARM templates, you can create 001 out of this. The service you can also make shorter, so you can do a lot of stuff with it. And if you actually use it like that, you can use the same words in your tagging convention as well, but then not the abbreviations. So you make it easy for people when they're creating ARM infrastructure as code to use your naming convention. Because this would produce something like this. These are a bunch of resources I have created using this module, where you see that it has a different name for the virtual machine all the way at the top, and the storage account all the way at the bottom, and even the key vault is in there, and it has a smaller one. By the way, I have this thing in detail on my blog. I have a very detailed explanation of what this does. I also have a blog post on an API I've created, which will collect that resource abbreviation. Because there's a resource abbreviation in every resource here, so the key vault is KV, and the application is APP. This is another tip: if you're using abbreviations for the resource type, get them from the Azure documentation. Because I also saw a lot of companies that made their own one, and it will drive you crazy. Yeah, it might be prettier. And I agree with the discussion we have, a log analytics workspace. Should that be log, or should it be law? Because law sounds so much cooler. But yeah, the Microsoft documentation said log, and okay, we can have cool stuff in other places. But I do recommend keep track of that, and I have created an API with an example of how you can create your own, so you can get that straight from the command line. If you want to know more about Bicep, by the way, there is a session by end of the day. End of the day, you can so see a session by Ed on Bicep, and there is one tomorrow by Freek and Esther about it as well. Really cool stuff. Another thing I created, which I think really helped, is some pester testing that helped with to see if all the tags that I wanted were there. So pester is a framework to test stuff in PowerShell, so PowerShell pester. And you can do this locally, or you can run this in a CI/CD pipeline. So these are the stuff you can also check with Azure Policies, but by doing it like this, you catch them before they even try to deploy themselves, so even before they make it through Azure. So I made a file that you can take from my blog and use yourself, and this checks if tag 1 and tag 2 are available, and you see that it fails for one of the resources because one of those tags isn't there. And if you use this in a CI/CD, you can make sure that the test fails because of this, because it fails here, and it will not deploy stuff to Azure, so it saves a lot of time. So all the things we talked about. I have some resources set up here, and I know that's not the best URL, so you can take a picture if you want to use it. The first thing is shamelessly plugging my own blog, Forbes to the 4.nl. If you go to the first page, the last posts I've written were about the naming convention module, the tagging testing, and how you can get the resource abbreviations, resource type abbreviations from Azure in an API. And I made a little collection. This is a collection in Microsoft Learn. And it's not that much, but these are all the relevant pages from the Cloud Adoption Framework from Microsoft documentation, as well as one little Learn module, which tells you all about tagging and governance and using Azure Policies. So, yeah, it could have been a better URL, but oh well. Hopefully you only need it once, and just all the articles that I used are behind there. So this is pretty much it for me. I'd like to thank the sponsors again. Awesome, they make these events possible. I have completely lost the slide where it says evaluate this session, but I would really appreciate if you could do that. If you want to find out more, you can, as I said, use my blog. And if you have any questions whatsoever at a later time, you can come down here and ask them now after the session, or you can find me on Twitter. So thank you, everyone.